Welcome back. In today's experiment, I'm going to demonstrate chemoluminescence, or light produced by a chemical reaction. To do this experiment, we're going to need several chemicals, including hydrogen peroxide, a buffer or weak base, sodium acetate, a dye, and then a trichlorophenyl oxalate ester. When these chemicals are mixed together in certain organic solvents, in this case I'm going to use diethyl phthalate. Now let me go into the chemistry. So this is your diphenyl oxalate. AR here stands for 2,4,6 dichlorophenyl. Now in the presence of a weak base, such as sodium acetate, and concentrated hydrogen peroxide, 35% hydrogen peroxide, this will break down and it'll form a reactive intermediate, which can be written like this. It's a highly strained intermediate, also known as an oxetane. So here's your carbonyl group, there's your other carbonyl group, and then here's your peroxide bridge. And this whole structure is an oxetane. So that's a dioxetane, an oxetane dione rather. And that can be written like that because it's a reactive intermediate. And that doesn't hang around very long. It's basically wanting to break apart into carbon dioxide, 2 molecules of carbon dioxide. And the breakdown into carbon dioxide is facilitated in the presence of an electron donor, in this case the dye, which is electron rich. We can write the dye. And there are different types of dyes. There are anthracenes, there's these rhodamine dyes, a whole series of those, and these are all electron-rich dyes that give this reactive intermediate an electron. So let me show you what happens in the presence of a dye. So if you have a dye present, an electron-rich dye, I'm just going to write it like that, dye, you get, the dye gives up one of its electrons and forms what's called a radical cation. That means it's lost an electron and become positively charged. And it's become reactive because it's given up an electron. And then one of those carbon dioxide molecules from the oxetane has accepted an electron and formed a radical anion plus another molecule of regular CO2. And the presence of the base also helps drive this reaction. Now that highly reactive CO2 radical anion doesn't want to stay in that state very long. So what it does is it gives the electron back to the dye. So you can write that like this. The dye radical cation plus the CO2 radical anion give each other electrons, and then the dye gets back its electron, but it also gets extra energy. Including the electron, it gains a bit of extra energy and goes into a higher energy level state. So we can put an asterisk near the dye to indicate the higher energy level state. And then it regenerates regular CO2. So now you have 2 molecules of CO2 given up. Now the dye in that excited state can't stay there very long. And it wants to give up that extra energy and drop back to a lower energy level. So what the dye does is it gives up the energy in the form of light, in the form of a light photon. I'm just going to write that like a lambda symbol there. Now, depending on the type of dye that you're using, for example, there's a series of different rhodamine dyes. You can get different types of colors like green, yellow, red, orange, etc. You can even have mixed dye combinations that you get the energy given off, which is seen as emitted light. Anthracenes tend to give a more bluish light or greenish light, whereas rhodamines tend to give a more sort of reddish or orange light. So that's the basic chemistry of it. So I take the sodium acetate, dissolve it in hydrogen peroxide 35%, and then all of these things are mixed already. I pre-mixed them in this beaker here. So your diphenyl oxalate, your rhodamine, and your solvent mixed together. It doesn't really matter how much solvent you used. This is just a random number that I'm using for this experiment. So what I'm going to do now is turn the lights down and show you what happens when I mix these two together. Now I'm going to add in the peroxide. Here goes. Instant light. Swish it around a little bit. Now to mix it better, I don't have a stir bar, so I'm going to put it in this bigger bottle where I can actually shake it a bit. And that should really demonstrate the effect, but isn't that amazing? The solvent also affects it too. So with the diethyl phthalate, the glow lasts longer, but you can also do it with ethyl acetate, and I think it's probably just as good, if not. Now I'm going to shake it up, and you should see it really turn bright as the reaction proceeds. There it goes. I can actually see with this. It's like a glow stick, or it's like one of those emergency lights that you get, chemical lights. But that's bright enough to see by. And in fact, this reaction is used in the military and also in EMS to be able to help in emergency situations, because the reaction goes on for several hours where you've got light production, and it's usable light. So here's our chemoluminescence, which is technically phosphorescence. And in this other beaker right here, I just have the dye dissolved in some of the solvent, but there's no other agents added to cause it to phosphoresce. But I'm going to use this UV light here and shine it on it, and look what happens. It excites it in the same way that the reactive intermediate generated in this chemical reaction does, and causes it to fluoresce. Fluorescence on the right, and you've got phosphorescence on the left, where the UV light photons excite the dye into a higher energy state. But then as soon as you turn the light off, it gives up that energy immediately. Whereas on the left, the energy is being continuously supplied, so it continues to glow. But I thought you would find that really interesting. I sure did. And hope you enjoyed the video and kind of understood the explanation. It's a little bit chemical in its nature, but it's definitely a cool reaction, and I really enjoyed doing this. But please don't forget to like. If you've got any comments or suggestions, please don't forget to put those down in the comments section. And if you're interested in further videos like this in electronics or other cool experiments, please don't forget to hit the bell and get notified. Thanks, and keep on experimenting.